Imagine a time before maps, before nations, when the world had no names and no borders, only the pulse of the earth beneath endless skies. Humanity was young then. Our ancestors, barefoot and brave, crossed lands no one had walked before and stared at oceans no one yet dared to sail. How did they choose where to go? What instinct whispered to them through wind and firelight? Perhaps it is the same whisper that still calls to us, to move, to wonder, to remember. Every step they took shaped the course of history, threading invisible lines across continents, until finally, those lines reached here, to this quiet corner of the Maine coast, where the sea still keeps their secret. When Nora Ellison stepped off the train at Willowmere station, she half expected no one to be there, and she was right. The platform stood empty, except for a single gull perched on the rail, and the smell of seaweed drifting inland. The air tasted of rain and salt. Somewhere beyond the fog, a bell buoy tolled a slow, mournful rhythm. Willowmere wasn't the kind of town you arrived in. It was the kind of town you slipped into, as though it had been waiting for you quietly all along. Narrow lanes wound past clapboard houses and weathered fences smothered in wild roses. Window boxes overflowed with late summer geraniums, and porch flags fluttered in the mist. It felt preserved, not frozen in time, but unhurried by it. She drove her borrowed truck down Harbor Road until the pavement thinned into gravel. The ocean appeared suddenly, startlingly close, a restless expanse of pewter gray stretching beyond sight. Her cottage stood at the cliff's edge like a steadfast sentinel, white trim, salt-blistered shingles, and a crooked chimney that seemed to exhale history itself. Inside, the rooms were small but kind. The floors sighed underfoot, and sunlight poured through salt-filmed windows in soft, slanted ribbons. Nora unpacked the essentials: notebooks, her father's old fountain pen, and the manuscript she'd sworn to finish. The first journeys, tracing the beginnings of us. Her father had died before completing it, leaving behind field notes, sketches of stone tools, and a half-finished chapter titled The Ones Who Wandered First. Finishing it here, at the edge of the Atlantic, felt right. After all, this was where journeys ended, or began again. That evening, the sky blushed violet as the tide slipped away from the rocks below. The air smelled of sea lavender and damp earth. Nora followed a narrow path down to the tide pools, her boots crunching over shells. There, half buried in kelp, something caught the last flicker of light. A stone, small and smooth as if polished by 1,000 years of water. When she lifted it, her thumb found the carved spiral, delicate, deliberate, circling inward until it disappeared into a single point. The shape stirred something deep and wordless in her, not fear, but recognition. She looked out across the water. The horizon melted into mist, and for a heartbeat she imagined a procession of shadowed figures walking along that far edge, silent, purposeful, carrying fire through the dark. Her rational mind told her it was nonsense. The anthropologist in her cataloged the possibilities: glacial markings, early settler carving, children's mischief. But another part of her, quieter and older, whispered, "No, it's a memory." Back at the cottage, Nora placed the spiral stone on her father's desk beside his papers. The lamplight caught its curves, turning the grooves into miniature valleys of shadow. On the wall hung a map of early human dispersal, arrows branching from Africa across the world. She traced one finger along a faint red line that ended near the Atlantic coast. "Maybe you made it further than we ever thought," she murmured. Outside, fog rolled in from the sea, pressing its cool breath against the window. She brewed chamomile tea, wrapped herself in a shawl, and listened to the hush of waves below. Somewhere in the sound, or perhaps only in her imagination, she heard the faint rhythm of footsteps echoing through time. For the first time since her father's passing, she felt him near, not as memory, but as continuity, as if the same current that carried those first wanderers across unknown lands had now carried her to this quiet cliff. When she finally turned off the lamp, the spiral stone glimmered faintly in the moonlight, its pattern a promise she didn't yet understand. And though the night was calm, Willowmere was already awake, whispering about the newcomer who had found something by the sea. Have you ever stepped into a place that seemed to remember you? Not a city of glass and engines, but a town where the air itself holds stories, where shutters creak like old voices and the smell of coffee mingles with salt and pine. Willowmere was that kind of place. It didn't hurry to tell you its secrets. It waited until you were quiet enough to hear them. Nora woke to the distant clang of a bell buoy and the low murmur of foghorns drifting through the gray dawn. The cottage walls glowed pale blue, washed in the reflection of the sea. She brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching mist coil across the cliffs like breath. The spiral stone lay where she'd left it, beside her father's manuscript, now surrounded by her notes. She ran a thumb across its cool surface again. The grooves seemed deeper in morning light, as though the pattern had shifted slightly overnight. She jotted a few observations in her notebook. Stone type, likely basalt. Engraving, deliberate, even pressure. Possible origin, unknown. The word unknown made her smile. It was her favorite kind of problem. By mid-morning, the fog began to thin, and she decided to explore the town. Willowmere's main street ran like a lazy river from the harbor to the old lighthouse, lined with wooden storefronts painted in sun-faded colors. The Gull's Nest Cafe, Harbor Books, Whitaker's Antiques, Post Office, established 1898. Locals greeted one another by first name, their conversations gentle as the tide. A pair of fishermen hauled crates of lobster traps onto a rust-red truck, pausing to wave as she passed. A golden retriever napped in front of the bakery, its tail thumping lazily whenever someone opened the door. Everywhere, she felt an undercurrent of belonging and of something held back, as if the town itself was protecting an old memory. The diner sat near the pier, a squat white building with red stools and windows clouded by steam. Inside, the smell of bacon and salt air mingled. A chalkboard read, "Clam Chowder Special, Ask Henry." She slid into a booth by the window. The waitress, a woman with silver hair pinned in a loose bun, brought her coffee before she asked. "New face," she said kindly. "Renting the Wren cottage, aren't you?" "Yes," Nora replied, surprised. "I just moved in last week." "People talk," the waitress said with a shrug and a smile. "Don't mind it." Willowmere's small, but the hearts are big. A man at the counter turned slightly, weathered face, gray beard trimmed short, a wool cap pulled low. "You're Ellison's girl," he said in a voice like gravel smoothed by tide. "The anthropologist." Nora blinked. "You knew my father?" "Not personally," he said, turning fully toward her. "But I read some of his papers. Henry Duvall used to fish these waters before I took to collecting stories instead." Henry's eyes were sharp, sea green, with a glint of humor behind their calm. "Word is, you found yourself a rock with a mark on it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A spiral. Carved, not natural." He tapped his mug thoughtfully. "Spirals show up in the strangest places. I saw some like that years ago, in the sea caves south of the lighthouse. Before the storm sealed them, folks said it was kids fooling around. I wasn't so sure. Something in his tone, not superstition, but reverence, made her lean closer. "You think there's more of them?" "Could be. Could be nothing." He smiled faintly. "But if you're the sort that listens close to the wind, Willowmere might tell you a few things." After lunch, Henry offered to walk her to the cliffs near the caves. They followed a narrow trail locals called the Old Coast Path, a ribbon of earth winding through dune grass and wild blueberry shrubs. The sea glittered below, calm now, deceptive in its peace. As they walked, Henry told her how the town got its name. Early settlers said the willows near the marshes never lost their leaves, even through winter storms. Folks thought it was because the ground here remembered the warmth of older suns. Nora smiled at the poetry of it. "So Willowmere remembers." He chuckled softly. "Everything here remembers, Miss Ellison. The trick is learning how to listen." When they reached the overlook, he pointed toward a dark outcrop farther south. That's where the caves used to open. After the 72 storm, the cliff collapsed and sealed them. Some say the sea did it to keep what's inside from washing away. They stood a while in silence, listening to gulls cry overhead. The horizon stretched endless and pale, as if time itself had thinned there. By dusk, Nora returned to the cottage with her mind buzzing quietly, not with fear or excitement, but with a strange serenity that comes from touching something ancient. She set the spiral stone on the windowsill, where it caught the last light. In her journal she wrote, "The town feels like an echo, as though it once witnessed something vast and has been whispering about it ever since." Outside, the tide rose, murmuring against the rocks. She brewed another pot of tea, wrapped herself in a sweater, and watched the sea grow dark. The spiral's shadow stretched across her father's unfinished manuscript, its curve merging with his handwriting, past and present twined together. As the first stars appeared, Nora thought she heard faint laughter carried on the wind from the direction of the harbor. Or perhaps it was only the sea talking in its sleep. Whatever it was, she knew one thing: the town had noticed her. And Willowmere, patient and secretive, had begun to open its pages. Every old house keeps its own heartbeat. Sometimes it's in the steady creak of the floorboards, or the sigh of wind through the eaves. Sometimes, if you listen long enough, you can almost hear it remembering the people who once lived inside, their laughter, their worries, the things they left unsaid. Nora Ellison had always loved that idea, that time didn't vanish, it just settled, layer by layer, waiting for the right hands to lift the dust. 3 days had passed since her walk with Henry. The ocean had grown restless, waves beating harder against the rocks, wind rattling the shutters at night. The weather forecast promised rain, but Nora didn't mind. Rain, she thought, was the sound of thinking. That afternoon, she sat at her father's desk, revisiting his field notes. Most were neat and methodical, sketches of ancient tools, measurements, migration maps. But near the end, his handwriting became looser, more emotional. On one page, she found a single line underlined twice. "The answers are older than the questions." She smiled faintly. It sounded like him, part scientist, part poet. But even surrounded by his work, something about the cottage felt unfinished. There was a draft that didn't belong, a hush in the rafters above her head, as if someone else was listening. Late in the afternoon, when the rain began to fall in soft silver lines against the windows, she decided to follow the feeling. Behind the kitchen pantry, half hidden by coats and boxes, she found a narrow wooden stairway leading upward, its steps so steep and slender she had to climb sideways. The attic greeted her with the scent of cedar, dust, and old salt air. Light seeped through a round window, pale and blue. Cobwebs draped the beams like lace. Stacks of forgotten trunks lined the wall, each marked with a name or date written in fading ink. One trunk, set apart from the others, bore a brass tag. M. Wren, 1946. She crouched beside it. The latch resisted at first, then gave with a sigh. Inside, the air felt different. Colder, somehow more deliberate, like the space had been sealed to preserve a secret. The contents were ordinary at first glance. Notebooks, field sketches, a worn compass, and a packet of yellowed photographs. Rock formations, cliff edges, patterns in stone, but at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a leather-bound journal. When Nora opened it, the smell of aged paper and salt drifted upward, like the ocean remembering a storm. The first page bore neat, slanted handwriting. Margaret Wren, Geological Survey, Willowmere Coast, 1944. Beneath it, a sketch, the exact same spiral that was carved into Nora's stone. Her breath caught. The following pages were dense with observations, notes about mineral layers, tidal erosion, fossilized impressions. But scattered between the scientific lines were fragments of something else, something deeply human. I feel as though they are close, the ones who walked before. Sometimes, when the tide recedes, I swear I see the outline of their steps. The sea does not destroy. It remembers. Nora traced the handwriting with her fingertip. Margaret Wren had been a scientist too, but there was longing here, an ache to connect with the unseen. At the back of the journal, she found an unfinished letter tucked between pages. If this ever reaches another hand, know that I did not imagine it. The stones speak. The spirals are their language, a message carved by wanderers who came not to settle, but to continue the story of us all. They are not myth, they are memory. Nora closed the book slowly. Outside, thunder rolled across the cliffs like a distant drum. She sat there for a long time, cross-legged on the attic floor, the journal open across her knees. The rain had thickened, drumming gently on the roof above. It felt as though the house itself was exhaling, finally relieved to have someone listening again. Two women, separated by nearly a century, connected by curiosity and solitude. Margaret Wren had been chasing the same ghost her father had, and now, without meaning to, so was she. She gathered the trunk's contents carefully, setting the journal aside to bring downstairs. Before she left, she paused by the small round window. Beyond it, the storm blurred sea and sky into one seamless gray, the horizon erased, and for just a moment, she could almost imagine a figure out there on the cliffs, still as stone, waiting for her to notice. That night, with the fire crackling low, Nora opened Margaret's journal again. The handwriting danced in the lamplight, delicate but unwavering. The spiral seemed to echo from the pages, looping endlessly. Not just a pattern, but a path. She wrote in her own notebook beside it. The same questions echo through generations. Maybe discovery isn't about finding answers. Maybe it's about hearing the same whisper and following it. The rain softened. The cottage settled into silence. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows like a hand, as if the night itself were saying, "Keep going." Some places hold their memories in air, others hide them in stone. Rock does not speak quickly. It takes centuries to form a single sentence. But if you kneel close enough, if you let your breath slow to match the rhythm of the tide, you can almost hear it, the murmur of everything that came before. The storm had passed overnight, leaving the world rinsed and bright. Willowmere glittered beneath a soft morning sun, every leaf washed clean, every puddle reflecting sky. From her window, Nora saw mist rising from the cliffs like smoke from an old fire. She packed a small satchel, notebook, camera, Margaret's journal, and the spiral stone, and walked toward the sea. The path wound through tall grasses still jeweled with rain. Henry Duvall was waiting near the overlook, hands in his coat pockets, a thermos of coffee steaming beside him. "Morning, Miss Ellison," he said, his voice mellow as weathered wood. "Perfect day for seeing ghosts." She smiled. "You really think we'll find something?" He looked toward the horizon. "I think the earth shows what it wants, when it wants. And today, she's feeling generous." Together they followed the narrow trail along the cliff edge. Below them, the tide was lower than usual, revealing the slick shimmer of rocks and sandbars that had slept beneath water for decades. They climbed down a winding path carved by rain and time, boots sliding on damp shale. The air smelled of salt and wild mint crushed underfoot. Waves whispered against the rocks, the sound both endless and intimate. At the base of the cliff, sunlight pooled in small tide basins. Algae gleamed emerald green. Tiny crabs scuttled through rivulets that traced silver threads across the sand. The world seemed suspended between stillness and motion, ancient, waiting. Nora opened Margaret's journal to a sketch labeled Stratum A2, Tidal Shelf East. She compared it to the rock face before them. Same angles, same fractures. Her pulse quickened. "This is where she stood," she murmured. Henry crouched near a flat expanse of stone half covered in seaweed. "Here," he said, brushing aside the slick growth. "What do you make of that?" Nora knelt beside him. Beneath the algae was a depression, shallow, rounded, roughly the size of a human foot. Another beside it, then a third, forming a gentle arc toward the cliff. She ran her fingertips along the edges. The stone was cool and smooth, the shapes too organic to be random, too purposeful to dismiss. "Could be coincidence," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "Could be," Henry said softly, "but sometimes coincidence is just the earth's way of repeating herself." The footprints, if that's what they were, curved slightly upward, vanishing under a ridge of shale where the tide would soon return. Nora felt the weight of centuries pressing through her fingertips, the sense that she wasn't just touching stone, but the residue of motion. They sat in silence. A gull circled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely. Around them, The ocean breathed. Exhale, inhale, the same rhythm that had carried their ancestors across continents. Nora opened her father's field notebook and began sketching quickly, her pencil scratching lightly over the page. Each line she drew felt like a bridge between times. Margaret's steady hand, her father's careful notation, and her own, trembling but alive with wonder. Henry poured her a cup of coffee from his thermos. The steam rose in thin white curls that mingled with the sea air. "Whatever those are," he said, "they've waited a long time to be seen again." She looked up at him. "Do you think it's possible that people came here before anyone thought they could have?" "I think stories travel faster than people," he replied. "Maybe they got here first, and the people just followed the echo." A gust of wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the scent of brine and rain-soaked stone. The sun flashed briefly through clouds, and the wet surface of the rocks shone gold. For an instant, she imagined she could see them. Faint silhouettes walking along the shore, burdened with nothing but their own endurance. Not explorers, not conquerors, just wanderers, following the horizon because it refused to stay still. Her chest ached with quiet awe. By the time they climbed back up, the tide had begun to reclaim the shelf. Water crept gently over the prints, filling them with rippling reflections until they disappeared beneath the waves once more. On the trail home, Nora turned for one last look. The sea was calm, unbothered, as if it had simply tucked its secret back under its arm. She carried the sense of that hidden world with her, not proof, but presence. In her notes that evening she wrote, "The footprints, if they are real, are not evidence of possession, but of passage. Whoever they were, they did not stay. They moved, as we all must." The wind picked up outside, sighing through the chimney. She closed Margaret's journal beside her father's and felt the strange comfort of three minds quietly conversing across time. When she finally blew out the lamp, the house creaked once, as though settling around her discovery, protective, approving, and from somewhere far off, the sea answered, its voice low and endless, repeating the same soft rhythm of steps through eternity. In every small town, news travels like weather, unseen at first, then suddenly everywhere. It drifts across fences, floats through open shop doors, curls with the steam of morning coffee, and when the story is strange enough, it no longer belongs to the person who started it. It belongs to the town itself. By the next morning, Willowmere already knew. Someone had seen Nora and Henry down by the cliffs. Someone else had seen her notebook. And by the time the first gulls settled on the docks, the story had taken on a life of its own. At the Gull's Nest Cafe, fishermen leaned over their coffee mugs, whispering about ancient tracks in stone. At the bakery, two women debated whether it was a prank or a sign. By midday, children were running along the beach, pressing their bare feet into the sand and shouting, "Look, I found another one." When Nora stopped by the post office, Mrs. Hensley, the postmistress, smiled knowingly. "Word is you've stirred the ghosts, dear," she said with a wink. "Don't worry, they're friendly ones." Nora laughed politely, though a small part of her wondered if there was truth hiding behind the humor. Seeking quiet, she went to the town library, a stone building that smelled of pine polish and paper. The windows rattled in their frames whenever the wind shifted. Behind the front desk sat Mabel Hawthorne, a woman whose white hair fell in a soft braid over one shoulder, her spectacles hanging from a silver chain. "I was expecting you," Mabel said as Nora approached. Her voice was gentle, weathered like driftwood. "Word travels faster than a seagull here. Henry told me you might come." "I suppose everyone's heard," Nora said, smiling faintly. "Of course. But don't mind them. Willowmere loves a story more than it loves proof." Mabel motioned for her to follow. They climbed the narrow stairs to the upper reading room, where tall windows framed the sea. The light there was diffuse and golden, filled with floating dust like tiny planets. "I think you should see this," Mabel said, opening a drawer and drawing out a folded piece of parchment. "My grandmother copied it from an older family book, part of an old poem we've kept for generations." She laid it on the table. The ink was faded but legible. They walked with the sea at their heels and fire in their hands. Their words were the wind, their names written in sand. No crown, no home, no promise to keep. They wandered awake while the earth was asleep. Nora read it twice, tracing each line with her eyes. Your family's had this all this time? Long as I can remember, Mabel said. We used to think it was just a story, something sailors told to their children about the first people who came from the sea. But when I saw the pattern on your stone, it stirred something. I've seen it before, in one of our town's old weather logs. She walked to a cabinet and withdrew a worn ledger dated 1862. Inside were careful notes about tides, wind direction, and barometric pressure. In the margin of one page, drawn absent-mindedly beside the word easterly, was a small spiral, nearly identical to Nora's. Mabel smiled softly. It's been here longer than any of us realized. The spiral comes and goes, like a visitor who never quite leaves. They talked until the light began to fade. Mabel spoke of local legends, of fire carriers who followed the setting sun, of the cliff caves once used by early mariners as beacons. Each story was stitched with affection, not fear. It's not a haunting, Mabel said at last. It's a remembering. The town's always known it, even if it didn't have words for it. Outside, the foghorn sounded its low, patient note. Nora closed her notebook and looked out the window where the horizon dissolved into mist. It's strange, she said softly. I came here to finish my father's work, to study human migration, to measure it. But it feels like this town doesn't need measuring. It already knows. Mabel chuckled. Science is just one way of listening, dear. Stories are another. Evening came slow, painting the world in rose and gold. Nora walked back through town as lights flickered on in the shop windows. The streets smelled of bread and salt and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle. At the harbor, Henry was mending a fishing net. You've been at the library, he said, not looking up. How did you... He laughed. Mabel called. Said you were glowing. I think I understand this place a little better now, Nora said. Good, but careful. Understanding Willowmere too quickly can make it jealous. Back at the cottage, she wrote in her journal, The town feels alive in the way fossils are alive, still holding breath in the spaces where life once moved. She set down her pen and listened. The wind brushed gently against the window panes. Somewhere out on the dark horizon, the tide was rising again, washing clean the traces of all that came before. Nora touched the spiral stone on her desk. It was warm, faintly, impossibly warm, as though it, too, had been listening to every word. She didn't know if she believed in myths, but she was beginning to believe in memory. We like to think of DNA as a code, a chain of numbers and letters, fixed and clinical. But sometimes when you look closely, it feels more like a story, a song humming quietly beneath our skin, waiting for the right moment to be heard. Every cell, every strand, is a tiny piece of time remembering where it came from. Rain returned to Willowmere, the slow, steady kind that softened the edges of everything. For a week, Nora stayed close to the cottage, writing, reading, thinking. The world beyond her windows blurred into watercolor. Gray sea, white gulls, green pines bowed in the wind. On her desk lay 2 sealed envelopes, one containing a DNA test kit she had mailed to a university colleague, the other a sample she'd collected from the fossilized impressions near the cliffs. She'd sent them both off, half out of curiosity, half out of habit, a scientist's way of anchoring wonder in evidence. Now she waited, and waiting, she realized, was its own kind of listening. Between the rainstorms, the town slipped into early summer. Wildflowers stitched the dunes in yellow and violet threads. The harbor air smelled of salt and lilac. Nora found herself growing attached to the slow rhythm of the place, to its quirks, its kindness. Mabel insisted she attend the weekly library tea hour. Henry coaxed her into helping at the Maritime Museum, where they dusted glass cases and hung photographs of the town's early fishermen. You see that one? Henry said one afternoon, pointing to a faded photo of a man holding a net of cod. My grandfather said the sea gave him everything, except answers. She smiled. He sounds like most scientists I know. Henry grinned. A fisherman is just a scientist without a lab coat. They shared quiet laughter. It felt good, easy, unforced, as though she'd always belonged there. The results came on a Thursday, slipped between an electricity bill and a postcard from a friend in Boston. Nora almost missed it. She tore open the envelope at her desk, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. Columns of data, graphs, reference populations, the language of her field. But tucked between the jargon were words that made her pause. Sample contains rare mitochondrial markers consistent with early Eurasian dispersal groups. This signature is uncommon in modern North American populations. Cross-reference suggests shared ancestry with lineages found in prehistoric coastal regions. Nora read the paragraph twice, then again. Early Eurasian, coastal lineage, uncommon. She looked toward the spiral stone on her desk, the sunlight slipping across its curves. A shiver ran through her. Not fear, but recognition. That evening, she found Henry by the docks, repairing an old lobster trap. The air was warm, the sea calm, a copper sun sinking low on the horizon. "I got the results," she said quietly. He raised an eyebrow. "And?" "Apparently I share rare genetic markers linked to early Eurasian populations. Coastal migrants. It's strange. It's like finding a name in my blood I didn't know I had." Henry leaned back on his crate, squinting at the light. "Funny you say that," he murmured. "I had one of those tests done a few years back. My niece bought it for me as a Christmas joke. Came back with something similar. Uncommon markers, they said. Nothing to worry about." Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft clink of metal against rope and the rhythmic hush of waves. "Maybe," Henry said finally, "we're both listening to the same old story, just told from inside us." That night, Nora walked along the beach, her shoes in hand, the sand cool beneath her feet. The tide was low again, exposing the tide pools and the rock shelf where the faint footprints waited beneath the moonlight. She crouched near the edge and touched the wet stone, her reflection shimmering over it. The air was still, heavy with salt. Somewhere in the rhythm of waves, she felt it, a pulse that wasn't the ocean's or hers alone. It was something shared, a continuity. Maybe her ancestors hadn't just crossed the land. Maybe they had left traces in her, in Henry, in every person who'd ever felt drawn to the water's edge without knowing why. Back home, she lit a candle and opened her father's manuscript to a half-finished paragraph. His last line read, "Migration is not a single movement. It's the heartbeat of the world repeating itself in different bodies." She smiled through the ache of memory. It felt as though he had written it for her, or for this exact moment. In her own notebook, she wrote beneath his words, "Perhaps what we call ancestry is just the earth recognizing itself again." The wind outside had quieted. The sea, for once, was utterly still. Nora closed her eyes, listening to that silence, full, immense, and alive. Somewhere beneath it, she could almost hear it. The faint, steady rhythm of countless footsteps echoing through the long corridors of time, all leading to this very shore. Some changes arrive like thunder, others come quietly, a shift in wind, a murmur beneath the surface. The sea, patient and watchful, never forgets what it has hidden. It only waits for the right tide to remember. Summer had deepened into its wildest mood. For 3 days, Willowmere held its breath beneath a brewing sky. The air tasted metallic, electric. Gulls flew low, their wings skimming the waves. The harbor swelled with uneasy rhythm. Ropes creaked, shutters rattled, the ocean gathering its voice. On the 4th evening, the storm broke. Rain fell in sheets, relentless and heavy. Thunder cracked above the cliffs like the tearing of old fabric. Nora sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching lightning trace the line where sea met sky. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt alive, as if the earth itself was turning a page, preparing to reveal what it had long kept folded between tides. Somewhere beyond the downpour, the ocean roared not in anger, but in purpose. When Nora stepped outside at dawn, the world smelled of salt and renewal. The air was cool, the light crystalline. The path down to the cliffs glistened with rainwater, every blade of grass tipped in silver. Henry was already there, standing near the overlook with his weathered cap in his hands. His expression was half disbelief, half reverence. "You'll want to see this," he said. They followed the trail south, boots squelching in the wet earth. The storm had bitten deep into the shoreline, sand stripped away, rock exposed, cliffs reshaped by the sea's hand. And there, at the base of the largest bluff, where the rock face had collapsed decades ago, a narrow opening gaped, dark and dripping. The sea caves, long sealed, long whispered about, had awakened. The entrance was framed by hanging seaweed and glimmering rivulets of water. The air smelled of minerals and ancient damp. Nora felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with a solemn anticipation, the feeling of standing at the threshold of time itself. Henry held a lantern, its glow trembling across the slick stone. The tunnel curved gently inward, leading to a chamber that opened like a cathedral carved by centuries of waves. Droplets fell rhythmically from the ceiling, echoing like the ticking of some primordial clock. And then, in the lantern's reach, she saw it. Carved into the rock wall at chest height, the spiral, perfectly formed, unmistakable, its grooves worn but not erased. The same pattern as her stone, Margaret's sketches, the old weather log, repeating, ageless, patient. Beneath it, the faint imprint of a hand, larger than hers, older than history. For a long time, neither spoke. The lantern light flickered against the spiral's edges, throwing soft shadows that moved like breathing. Nora lifted her fingers and pressed them gently to the stone. It was cold, smooth, unyielding, yet alive in a way she could not explain. The grooves seemed to hum faintly under her skin, a vibration too subtle to be sound. Henry whispered almost to himself, "They marked this place. Not to claim it, but to remember it." She nodded, like a return address on the world. He smiled, eyes shining with salt and wonder, or a prayer that someone, someday, would find it again. A sudden swell sent water surging into the lower chamber. The sound filled the cave, not violent but powerful, like a deep exhale from the ocean itself. The lantern's flame wavered, throwing a dance of gold across the wet walls. Nora closed her eyes and listened. In that echoing space, the line between now and then dissolved. She could almost hear voices layered in the water's rhythm, not words, but tones, as if the earth itself was singing back its own memory. For a fleeting instant, she felt she was standing among them, the wanderers, the first travelers, faces lit by firelight, eyes reflecting the same sea. When she opened her eyes, the spiral still glowed faintly with reflected light, its center filled with shadow that seemed to breathe. They emerged from the cave into soft afternoon sunlight. The sky was clearing, streaked with pink and gold. Behind them, the waves lapped gently at the mouth of the newly opened passage, as if guarding what remained within. Neither of them spoke until they reached the crest of the hill. Then Henry said quietly, "We should tell Mabel." Nora nodded. "Yes, but not everyone." He gave her a knowing look. "No, some secrets aren't meant to be proved, just protected." That night, Nora sat by her desk, hands still damp with the scent of stone. She placed the spiral stone beside her lantern, its grooves gleaming softly in the light. In her notebook she wrote, "The sea does not destroy, it reveals. It opens doors between moments and asks only that we notice." Outside, the tide rose high again, sliding into the cliffs with a gentle, rhythmic hush. Somewhere within that sound, Nora thought she heard it. Not a roar this time, but a whisper. "Welcome back." Old letters carry a kind of gravity. They are fragments of breath turned into ink, the living voice of someone who trusted the future to listen. When Nora opened the first of Margaret's envelopes, she realized she wasn't just reading history, she was being read by it. 2 days after the storm, the sky over Willowmere turned a clean, endless blue. The air smelled of kelp and clover. Nora walked to the library, her steps lighter than usual, though her mind still echoed with the hum of the sea caves. Mabel greeted her at the door with a smile and a stack of yellowed envelopes bound in twine. "I thought you'd want to see these," she said. "I was reorganizing the archives, and guess who turned up?" The handwriting on the top envelope stopped Nora cold. Margaret Wren. The ink was faint but elegant, the script precise, the same hand that filled the journal in Nora's attic. "I didn't even know we had these," Mabel said. "Seems they were tucked inside an old box of geological reports from the 1940s. They were addressed to a museum in Boston, but from what I can tell, they were never sent." Nora took the bundle carefully, as if it might dissolve under her touch. "Unsent letters," she murmured, "like messages the world wasn't ready for." Mabel nodded. "Exactly. I think they were meant for you." That evening, Nora sat by the cottage window as the sun melted into the sea. She untied the twine and unfolded the first letter. The paper crackled softly, releasing the faint scent of cedar and thyme. August 12th, 1944. To whom it may someday concern. If you are reading this, you have found what I could not finish. The evidence is here, not of settlers, not of myths, but of people who walked long before our maps existed. I have traced their language in stone, their rhythm in the tides. They were travelers, like us. They sought continuity, not conquest. I have tried to share this with the Boston Geological Society, but they call it an indulgent fantasy. They do not hear the music beneath the data. They do not feel the pulse of the earth beneath their boots. Perhaps you will. Yours, in faith of the unseen, Margaret Wren. Nora's throat tightened. She could almost hear the voice. Soft, determined, lonely. A woman ahead of her time, silenced by those who mistook wonder for weakness. The next few letters painted a picture both inspiring and heartbreaking. Margaret had corresponded briefly with a curator in Boston who encouraged her research, but after she mentioned fossilized human impressions and symbols preceding recorded civilization, the tone of their replies turned cold. "Your enthusiasm is noted, Miss Wren, but your conclusions exceed the realm of scientific plausibility." By her final draft, Margaret's writing had changed. The measured academic tone replaced with quiet defiance. "Even if no one believes me, I know they walked here, not to conquer, but to continue the story of us all." Nora read the line again and again until it blurred through her tears. Later that night, she spread Margaret's journal and letters across her desk. The lamplight turned the pages into islands of gold in a sea of shadow. Her own notes, her father's words, the spiral stone, the DNA results, all converged there, overlapping like transparent layers of the same map. Margaret had seen it first. Her father had sensed it. And now, Nora was living it. The same current flowing through three lives separated by decades, bound by the same unanswerable question. "Where did we begin?" she whispered aloud. "You weren't wrong, Margaret. You were just early." Outside, the sea wind pressed against the window panes, a soft percussion beneath her words. At the bottom of the bundle, one last envelope lay sealed, darker than the rest. The wax bore a faint imprint. The spiral. Nora hesitated before breaking it open. "If this reaches you, then the world has learned to listen again. Do not look for proof, look for pattern. The stone, the wind, the salt in our blood, they are all parts of the same memory. We are not descended from wanderers. We are the continuation of their motion. Remember this when you doubt. We are still walking." Nora set the letter down slowly. The words lingered in her like warmth after a fire, not revelation, but confirmation. She walked outside, the air cool and silver with twilight. The cliffs glowed faintly in the distance, mist curling around their base. In her chest, she felt the same steady pulse she'd felt in the cave, the rhythm of belonging that transcended proof. Margaret's voice, her father's, her own, all part of the same conversation, continued across time. When she returned indoors, she carefully placed the letters in a wooden box beside the spiral stone. Then she sat by the fire, the flames painting the room in amber light, and whispered softly, "We're still walking, Margaret. I'll keep the story going." The house creaked once in response, gentle and approving, as if it too remembered. Outside, the sea breathed evenly, eternal, watchful, and kind. Every discovery begins as one person's whisper. But in small towns, especially towns that listen, whispers don't stay small for long. They ripple outward, changing shape, until they return as something greater. A story that belongs to everyone. It was Henry's idea first. "You can't keep all this to yourself, Nora," he'd said one afternoon at the museum. "What you found, it's not just science. It's a piece of Willowmere's soul. Let the town see." Nora hesitated. "It's not proof of anything." "Doesn't have to be," Henry replied with a smile. "Proof is for the head. This one's for the heart." And so the plan formed. A small evening gathering at the lighthouse. Not a formal lecture, not a presentation, just a moment of sharing. Mabel offered to curate the letters. Henry promised to bring the lanterns. Nora, still uncertain but moved by their faith, agreed to read a few passages aloud. As the day approached, the town seemed to hum with quiet excitement. Someone swept the path to the lighthouse. Someone else strung tiny white lights along the railings. The bakery contributed trays of lemon scones and sugar cookies shaped like seashells. By dusk, the old lighthouse, its glass tower now long retired, glowed softly from within, ready to hold its newest memory. The townspeople arrived as the last light faded from the horizon. The air smelled of salt and cinnamon. Gulls settled along the rocks, their cries blending with the distant sigh of the waves. Inside, lanterns hung from iron hooks, casting golden halos over the walls. Nora stood near a table where the spiral stone rested beside Margaret Wren's journal and letters. Mabel had arranged everything with care. Lace runner, small placards, a vase of wildflowers from the marsh. Children pressed their noses to the glass, whispering to each other. Older residents nodded thoughtfully, the way people do when something familiar has finally found its name. Henry called for quiet. "Friends," he said, his voice echoing softly off the stone walls. "Tonight isn't about what's proven. It's about what's remembered." He turned to Nora. "You have the floor, Professor." She laughed lightly at the title, though her heart thudded. She looked at the faces before her, kind, curious, expectant, and took a steadying breath. "When I came here," she began, "I thought I was finishing my father's research. I didn't expect to find a conversation that began long before either of us existed." She gestured toward the spiral stone. "This symbol appeared in my work, in the cliffs, in the cave, in your town records, across decades, even centuries. I don't know exactly what it means. Maybe no one can. But when I touch it, I feel continuity, as though the same hands that carved it still exist in some form, in all of us." The crowd listened silently, the only sound the low hum of the lanterns and the distant crash of surf. Nora opened Margaret Wren's final letter and read aloud. "They are not myth, they are memory. We are not descended from wanderers, we are the continuation of their motion." When she looked up, a few people were smiling. A few had tears shining in their eyes. "I think," Nora said softly, "that's what Willowmere has always understood, that we are not separate from the stories beneath our feet. We're the newest verse in a very old song." Afterward, the townsfolk stepped outside. Henry had set out small paper lanterns along the cliffs. Each held a candle, flickering gold against the dark. Children carried them carefully to the shoreline, where the tide was just beginning to rise. One by one, they placed the lanterns on the water. The candles drifted outward, glowing softly against the waves, tiny constellations moving toward the horizon. Someone began humming an old sea tune. Others joined, quietly at first, then stronger, until the air was filled with gentle melody. Mabel stood beside Nora and squeezed her hand. "You see," she whispered, "the town always remembers how to listen." Later, when the last of the lanterns had vanished into the dark, Nora lingered by the cliff. The lighthouse light, long extinguished, caught the moon's reflection and shimmered faintly, as if it too wanted to shine once more. Henry came to stand beside her. "You gave them something tonight," he said. She shook her head. "They gave it to me. I just reminded them it was theirs." He chuckled softly. "That's what all good historians do." The wind carried the scent of burning candles and sea salt. Below, the tide murmured against the rocks, whispering the same rhythm that had guided the first wanderers, the same that now carried their descendants home. When Nora returned to her cottage, she paused by the window overlooking the ocean. The horizon was dark but alive with reflected starlight. She could still see the faint glow of lanterns drifting far out at sea, small but steady, like footprints of fire across the water. She opened her journal and wrote, "Discovery is not possession. It's remembrance. Tonight, Willowmere remembered." The ink shimmered in the lamplight. Outside, the waves rolled on. Slow, eternal, patient. And somewhere deep beneath them, the earth smiled in its sleep. There is a kind of silence that isn't empty, a silence that hums with everything that ever was. When the wind moves through it, it doesn't erase sound, it carries memory. Every gust, every sigh through the reeds is the world remembering itself. Dawn rose slowly over Willowmere. The horizon blushed rose and gold, the sea calm as glass. The storm's scoured cliffs shimmered with dew. Nora stepped barefoot onto the porch, a shawl around her shoulders, a mug of steaming tea in her hands. The air smelled of pine and salt. Below, gulls drifted lazily above the tide pools, and the lighthouse glowed faintly in the newborn light. Her desk behind her was tidy now, her father's notes bound neatly beside Margaret's letters, the spiral stone resting between them like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. She had written through the night, finishing her own manuscript. The First Wanderers, The Memory of Motion. Not a scientific report, not a theory, but a story, one that honored both proof and wonder. As the sun cleared the edge of the sea, Nora followed the path down to the cliffs. The tide was low again, the rock shelf glistening under the light. She could still make out where the footprints had been before the waves had reclaimed them, faint impressions that existed now only in memory. She carried the spiral stone in her hand. It felt warm from the sun, smooth as skin. When she reached the edge, she stood for a long time, breathing in the sound of waves against stone, steady, rhythmic, eternal. The same sound her father had listened to when he dreamed of humanity's first journeys. The same that must have echoed for Margaret Wren as she drew her sketches here 80 years before. The same wind brushed across her face now, carrying the faint scent of seaweed and rain, and something else, something ancient and familiar. She closed her eyes and heard it, not as words, but as understanding. No one told them to move. No map guided their way. They followed the breath of the world. It wasn't a revelation. It was a recognition, as if her bones themselves had been waiting to remember. Nora smiled, tears stinging her eyes, and whispered back, "And we're still walking." She knelt and placed the spiral stone on the wet rock. The water slid gently around it, glinting in the light like liquid glass. Slowly, the next wave reached up and lifted it away, pulling it toward the open sea. For a moment it caught the sunlight, flashing once like a star, and then it was gone, rolling gently into the horizon, into the great current that would carry it who knows where. Nora watched until her reflection blurred in the tide. Then she rose, brushing the sand from her hands, feeling both smaller and larger than she had ever felt. The sea had taken back its secret, but left her something far greater, peace. She walked slowly back through the tall grass, the morning wind tugging at her hair. From the hilltop, she could see the town waking. Smoke curling from chimneys, laundry lines stirring, Mabel unlocking the library door. Henry waved from the harbor, his figure a dark outline against the light. Everything looked the same, but nothing was. The world felt newly born, though nothing in it had changed except her way of seeing. At her desk, she wrote her final entry. "We did not inherit the earth. We inherited a journey. Every step we take, every choice we make, continues that first motion, the same motion that carried us out of Africa, across the ice, through time, and into this quiet morning. The wind across the cliffs is not just air, it's breath, the shared breath of everyone who ever lived." She signed her name beneath it and closed the notebook gently. Outside, the wind rose again, moving through the open window, lifting a corner of the curtain. It touched her cheek softly, as if in thanks, and passed on. At the edge of the world, the stone drifted beneath the waves, its spiral gathering light. Currents carried it onward, past kelp forests, beneath glimmering shoals, into the great blue silence where sound becomes memory. And somewhere far above, on the cliffs of Willowmere, a woman stood listening to the sea's endless breathing, no longer searching for answers because she had become part of the question itself. The tide whispered against the rocks, eternal and kind. Keep walking.